In the scorching heat of Tombstone, Arizona, where the desert wind carried whispers of death and the saloon doors never stopped swinging, there lived a boy who knew nothing but pain. 10-year-old Samuel Creek had calloused hands that should have been holding marbles and scraped knees that came not from childhood games, but from the daily beatings he endured at Murphy's saloon. Every morning, as the sun painted the dusty streets gold, Samuel would sweep the floors, clean the spittoons, and polish the brass rail that ran along the bar, all while dodging the cruel fists and boots of drunken cowboys who saw him as nothing more than entertainment. The boy's story was one that nobody in town dared to speak aloud, though everyone knew it by heart. His parents had died in a wagon accident 3 years prior, leaving him to the mercy of Tobias Murphy, a man whose heart was as black as the crude oil that bubbled up from the earth in distant Texas. Murphy had taken Samuel in, not out of kindness, but because free labor was hard to come by, and a defenseless orphan made the perfect victim for his twisted sense of power. The first hook came on a Tuesday morning when Samuel's screams echoed through the saloon louder than usual, catching the attention of a mysterious figure who had just ridden into town. The stranger sat atop a midnight black stallion, his face hidden beneath the shadow of a weathered hat, and his long coat dusty from what appeared to be months of hard travel. What made this man different from the countless drifters who passed through Tombstone wasn't his appearance, but the way he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen death and walked away from it more times than most men draw breath. When the stranger's steel-gray eyes locked onto the saloon where Samuel's cries originated, something shifted in the air, as if the very desert itself sensed that change was coming to this forgotten corner of the world. Inside Murphy's saloon, the scene was as predictable as the sunrise. Samuel lay curled on the sawdust-covered floor, his small frame shaking as 3 cowboys took turns kicking him while Murphy watched from behind the bar, counting the previous night's earnings with the detached interest of a man watching ants burn under a magnifying glass. The boy had committed the unforgivable sin of accidentally dropping a bottle of whiskey while serving a table of card players, and in Murphy's establishment, such clumsiness demanded payment in blood. The cowboys, their names as forgettable as their faces, laughed as they delivered their punishment, each kick accompanied by crude jokes about orphans and their place in the world. Samuel had learned long ago not to fight back or even cry out too loudly, as resistance only made the beatings longer and more severe. Instead, he counted the sounds of the desert through the saloon's thin walls, the distant cry of a hawk, the whisper of wind through the sagebrush, anything to take his mind away from the immediate agony of his existence. The stranger pushed through the saloon doors with the fluid motion of water flowing downstream, his spurs singing a soft melody against the wooden floor as every conversation died and every head turned in his direction. There was something about the man that commanded attention without demanding it, a presence that filled the room like smoke from a campfire. His hand rested casually on the grip of a Colt Peacemaker that hung low on his right hip, and those who knew weapons could see that the leather of his holster was worn smooth from countless draws. Murphy looked up from his counting, his piggy eyes narrowing as they took in this newcomer who dared to interrupt his daily ritual of cruelty. The stranger's gaze swept the room slowly, taking in every detail, from the faded paintings of dancing girls on the walls to the blood-stained sawdust at Samuel's feet, before finally settling on the boy's tormentors with the intensity of a judge preparing to pass sentence. Without a word, the stranger walked to the bar and ordered whiskey, his voice carrying the accent of a man who had traveled far beyond the borders of any single state. Murphy poured the drink with hands that trembled slightly, though he would have denied such weakness if asked. The 3 cowboys, emboldened by numbers and whiskey, continued their assault on Samuel, apparently unconcerned by the newcomer's presence. It was then that the stranger spoke again, his words cutting through the saloon's atmosphere like a blade through silk. He asked Murphy about the boy, inquiring why a child was being beaten in broad daylight while grown men watched for entertainment. Murphy's response was predictable, a rambling explanation about property rights and the natural order of things, punctuated by crude laughter from the cowboys who clearly expected this outsider to mind his own business and move on like so many others before him. The second hook arrived when the stranger set his glass down on the bar with deliberate slowness, the sound echoing through the suddenly silent saloon like a gunshot. What happened next would be talked about in hushed whispers for years to come, though those who witnessed it would always struggle to describe exactly how fast the man moved. One moment he was standing at the bar, seemingly relaxed and unconcerned, and the next he was behind the largest cowboy, his arm wrapped around the man's throat in a chokehold that had been perfected through years of frontier survival. The cowboy's feet kicked frantically as his air supply was cut off, while his two companions scrambled for their weapons with the clumsy desperation of men who had never faced a real gunfighter. The stranger's voice remained calm as he explained the new rules that would govern Murphy's saloon from that moment forward. Rules that placed the boy under his protection and promised swift retribution for anyone who dared to harm Samuel again. When the cowboy in the chokehold finally went limp, the stranger released him, letting the unconscious man fall to the floor like a sack of grain. The other two cowboys found themselves staring down the barrel of the Colt Peacemaker, which had appeared in the stranger's hand with supernatural speed. Their own weapons remained half-drawn, frozen in their holsters by the realization that they were facing someone whose skills far exceeded their own. Murphy sputtered protests about the law and property rights, but his words carried no weight against the cold authority that radiated from the man who had just transformed his saloon from a place of cruelty into something resembling a courtroom. The stranger's ultimatum was simple and non-negotiable. Anyone who laid a hand on the boy would answer to him personally, and given what they had just witnessed, none of them doubted his ability to make good on such a threat. Samuel struggled to his feet, his body aching from the morning's punishment, but his eyes wide with wonder as he looked upon the man who had appeared like an avenging angel from the desert itself. The stranger helped the boy to a chair, his movements gentle despite the violence he had just demonstrated, and for the first time in 3 years, Samuel felt something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. The man introduced himself simply as Jeremiah Cole, though he offered no explanation of where he had come from or why he had chosen to intervene on behalf of a beaten orphan boy. His presence alone was enough to transform the dynamics of the saloon, as cowboys who had moments before been eager participants in Samuel's suffering now found excuses to finish their drinks and leave. Murphy retreated behind his bar like a spider returning to its web, his eyes filled with the kind of hatred that festers in darkness but fears to show itself in the light. Over the following days, Jeremiah Cole became a fixture in Tombstone, though he remained an enigma to everyone who encountered him. He took a room at the boarding house run by Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a widow whose husband had died in a mining accident the previous year, and he paid his bills with gold coins that bore markings unfamiliar to the local merchants. During the day, he could be found at Murphy's saloon, not drinking or gambling, but simply watching, his presence serving as an invisible shield around Samuel as the boy went about his daily chores. The transformation in Samuel was remarkable to behold, as the constant fear that had marked his every movement began to fade, replaced by a cautious optimism that manifested in small ways. A smile when no one was looking, a straighter posture when carrying trays, and eyes that no longer darted constantly toward the exits as if planning an escape. But Jeremiah Cole's protection came with mysteries that deepened with each passing day. Late at night, when the desert cooled and honest folk retired to their beds, he could be seen walking the streets of Tombstone with the purposeful stride of a man searching for something specific. Mrs. Hartwell noticed that his room contained no personal possessions beyond his weapons and a small leather journal that he wrote in by candlelight, his pen scratching across the pages with the urgency of someone recording important information. The local sheriff, a man named Bill Crenshaw who had grown fat and lazy on Murphy's bribes, began asking questions about the stranger's business in town, though he was careful never to confront Jeremiah directly after hearing detailed accounts of what had transpired in the saloon. The first twist in Samuel's story came when the boy discovered something that changed everything he thought he knew about his protector. While cleaning Jeremiah's room at Mrs. Hartwell's boarding house, Samuel found a wanted poster that had fallen from the man's coat pocket. A yellowed piece of paper that bore a sketch of Jeremiah's face above the words, "Wanted dead or alive," and a reward of $5,000. The charges listed were numerous and serious: bank robbery, cattle rustling, and the murder of 3 lawmen in a town called Cedar Rapids, Nebraska. Samuel's hands shook as he held the poster, his young mind struggling to reconcile the image of his gentle protector with that of a wanted criminal whose crimes had apparently spanned multiple states and several years. The revelation sent Samuel into a spiral of confusion and fear that he struggled to hide from Jeremiah. During their daily conversations, as the gunslinger taught him to read using old newspapers and showed him how to handle himself in a fight, Samuel found himself studying the man's face, searching for signs of the killer described on the wanted poster. But all he saw was kindness in those steel-gray eyes, patience in the way Jeremiah answered his endless questions about life beyond Tombstone, and genuine concern when Samuel flinched at sudden movements or loud noises. The contradiction ate at the boy's conscience like acid, forcing him to confront the possibility that the world was far more complicated than his 10 years of experience had prepared him to understand. Meanwhile, Murphy's resentment toward Jeremiah grew like cancer, fed by the loss of his favorite entertainment and the subtle shift in power that the gunslinger's presence had created within the saloon. The fat saloon owner began reaching out to contacts in other towns, putting word on the telegraph lines that a dangerous man was hiding in Tombstone under the protection of local ignorance. Murphy's inquiries eventually reached the desk of Marshal Theodore Vaughn, a federal lawman based in Phoenix who had been tracking Jeremiah Cole for over 2 years. Vaughn was known throughout the territory as a man who never gave up on a case, no matter how cold the trail became, and the news that his quarry had surfaced in Tombstone filled him with the kind of satisfaction that comes from knowing a long hunt is finally nearing its end. Samuel's internal struggle reached a breaking point when he overheard Murphy dictating a telegram to the Western Union operator, providing detailed descriptions of Jeremiah and requesting immediate assistance from federal marshals. The boy realized that his protector was walking into a trap, and that his own discovery of the wanted poster had come at the worst possible time. Samuel faced a choice that would have challenged men 3 times his age: remain silent and allow the law to take its course, potentially losing the only person who had ever shown him kindness, or warn Jeremiah and become an accessory to whatever crimes the man had committed in his past. The weight of this decision pressed down on Samuel like the desert heat, making every breath feel labored and every heartbeat seem loud enough to wake the dead. The second major twist occurred when Samuel finally worked up the courage to confront Jeremiah about the wanted poster, approaching the gunslinger during one of their evening walks through Tombstone's dusty streets. What he discovered challenged everything he thought he understood about justice, law, and the nature of good and evil. Jeremiah listened to Samuel's stammering questions without interruption, his face showing neither surprise nor anger at the boy's confession of having searched through his belongings. When Samuel finished speaking, Jeremiah sat on a wooden crate behind the general store and told a story that reframed everything the boy thought he knew about his protector's past. Jeremiah Cole had indeed been present at the bank robbery in Cedar Rapids, but not as a perpetrator. He had been the sheriff of that small Nebraska town, a lawman with a wife and young daughter who believed in justice and the rule of law. The 3 men listed as his victims on the wanted poster had been corrupt deputies who had been secretly working with a gang of cattle rustlers led by a man named Black Pete Morrison. When Jeremiah discovered their betrayal and moved to arrest them, they had ambushed him at his home, killing his wife and daughter in the crossfire of a gunfight that left all 3 deputies dead. The bank robbery charges stemmed from his desperate attempt to recover stolen money that the corrupt deputies had hidden, money that he had hoped to use to start a new life far from the memories that haunted every corner of Cedar Rapids. The revelation hit Samuel like a physical blow, as he realized that the man he had feared might be a dangerous criminal was actually a victim of the same kind of injustice that had shaped Samuel's own life. Jeremiah explained that he had been running for 2 years, staying ahead of Marshal Vaughn and a legal system that had branded him an outlaw without bothering to investigate the true circumstances of the case. His arrival in Tombstone hadn't been random. He had been following rumors of Black Pete Morrison's gang, believing that they might have moved their operations to Arizona territory. Samuel's situation in Murphy's saloon had simply been an unfortunate coincidence that Jeremiah couldn't ignore, given how much the boy's suffering reminded him of his own daughter's innocence. As if summoned by the power of their conversation, Marshal Theodore Vaughn arrived in Tombstone the next morning, accompanied by 2 deputies and armed with federal warrants that gave him authority to take Jeremiah Cole dead or alive. Vaughn was a man carved from the same stone as the desert mountains, tall and lean with eyes that had seen too much violence and a jaw set in permanent determination. He had tracked men across 3 states and 2 territories, and his reputation for never giving up on a case had earned him both respect and fear throughout the American West. when he walked into Murphy's saloon and announced his intention to arrest Jeremiah Cole. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees despite the blazing afternoon sun outside. Jeremiah received word of the marshal's arrival from Mrs. Hartwell, who had observed the lawmen checking into the town's other boarding house and making inquiries about strangers who might be staying in Tombstone. The gunslinger's reaction surprised Samuel, as instead of preparing to run or fight, Jeremiah seemed almost relieved that the long chase was finally coming to an end. He spent the afternoon writing in his leather journal, filling page after page with what appeared to be a detailed account of events that had led him to become a wanted man. When Samuel asked about his plans, Jeremiah simply smiled and said that sometimes a man reaches a point where running becomes more exhausting than standing still. The final confrontation began at sunset, as the desert sky painted itself in shades of red and gold that seemed to foreshadow the blood that everyone expected to be spilled before darkness fell. Jeremiah walked into Murphy's saloon with the calm deliberation of a man attending his own funeral, while Samuel watched from the boarding house window with tears streaming down his face. The boy had begged his protector to flee, to take him along and start a new life in California or Oregon. But Jeremiah had gently refused, explaining that some problems couldn't be solved by running away. He had given Samuel his leather journal, asking the boy to keep it safe and to read it when he was old enough to understand the full weight of the story it contained. Inside the saloon, Marshal Vaughn stood with his back to the bar, his two deputies positioned at strategic points that would give them clear lines of fire regardless of where Jeremiah chose to position himself. Murphy watched from behind his usual place at the bar, his face flushed with excitement at the prospect of witnessing the violent end of the man who had disrupted his comfortable routine of cruelty. The other patrons had cleared out upon learning of the marshal's intentions, leaving the saloon feeling larger and emptier than usual, like a stage set for a final act that everyone knew would end in tragedy. But the greatest twist of all came not from Jeremiah's guns or the marshal's warrants, but from an unexpected source that no one in the saloon could have anticipated. As Jeremiah raised his hands in apparent surrender, speaking calmly about his desire to tell his side of the story before any shooting began, the saloon doors burst open to admit a figure that changed everything. Black Pete Morrison himself, the very man whose criminal activities had destroyed Jeremiah's life and made him a fugitive. Morrison was a mountain of a man with hands like hawks and a face marked by violence, accompanied by 4 members of his gang who had been hiding in Tombstone for weeks, waiting for the right moment to rob the town bank. Morrison's arrival created a 3-way standoff that no one had planned for, as the outlaw leader recognized both Jeremiah and Marshal Vaughn from previous encounters across the frontier. The gang leader's booming laugh filled the saloon as he realized the irony of the situation. The marshal who had been chasing Jeremiah was now in the same room with the real criminal whose activities had made Jeremiah a wanted man in the first place. Morrison's men drew their weapons with practiced efficiency, while the marshal's deputies found themselves caught between 2 different sets of enemies in a confined space where any shooting would likely result in multiple casualties. It was Jeremiah who broke the standoff, not with violence, but with words that cut through the tension like a scalpel through flesh. He addressed Marshal Vaughn directly, explaining in clear, measured tones exactly who Black Pete Morrison was and detailing the evidence that would prove the outlaw's responsibility for the crimes that had been attributed to Jeremiah. Morrison's reaction confirmed everything Jeremiah said, as the gang leader's face twisted into a snarl of rage at being identified and his hand moved instinctively toward his gun. The marshal, who had spent 2 years building a case against Jeremiah, suddenly found himself confronted with the possibility that he had been chasing the wrong man while the real criminal had been operating freely throughout the territory. The gunfight that followed was swift, brutal, and decisive. Morrison drew first, his massive Colt roaring like thunder as he aimed for Jeremiah's chest. But the former sheriff's reflexes were faster than his enemy remembered. Jeremiah's return shot took Morrison's center mass, spinning the big man around like a child's top before he crashed into a table of chairs with enough force to shake the entire building. The marshal's deputies engaged Morrison's gang with professional efficiency, their training showing as they used cover and coordinated their fire to maximum effect. Marshal Vaughn himself proved why his reputation had spread throughout the West, his gun barking 4 times in rapid succession as he eliminated threats with the cold precision of a master craftsman. When the smoke cleared and the ringing in everyone's ears began to fade, Black Pete Morrison lay dead beside an overturned table. His dreams of easy money in Tombstone ended by the same violence he had used to build his criminal empire. 3 of his gang members were also dead, while the 4th had taken a bullet through the shoulder and was begging for medical attention between sobs of surrender. Marshal Vaughn holstered his weapon and looked at Jeremiah with new eyes, the wanted poster in his pocket suddenly feeling like a document from another lifetime. The federal lawman had spent enough years on the frontier to recognize the ring of truth when he heard it, and everything about the gunfight had confirmed Jeremiah's version of events in ways that no court testimony could have matched. Murphy, who had cowered behind his bar during the shooting, now emerged to survey the damage to his establishment with the calculating eyes of a man wondering if his insurance would cover bullet holes and bloodstains. His disappointment at seeing Jeremiah alive and apparently vindicated was written clearly across his face, though he was careful not to express such feelings aloud in the presence of a federal marshal. The saloon owner began mentally preparing explanations for why he had summoned lawmen to arrest a man who had just helped eliminate one of the territory's most wanted criminal gangs, though he suspected that Marshal Vaughn was intelligent enough to see through any lies he might attempt to construct. Samuel burst through the saloon doors just as Marshal Vaughn was examining Morrison's body, the boy's fear for his protector overcoming his usual caution around strangers and authority figures. The sight of Jeremiah standing unharmed beside the marshal filled Samuel with relief so profound that he nearly collapsed, his young legs suddenly feeling too weak to support his weight. Jeremiah caught the boy in a gentle embrace, reassuring him that everything was going to be all right while Marshal Vaughn watched the interaction with growing understanding of the relationship between the former sheriff and the orphan child. Over the following days, as Marshal Vaughn conducted his investigation and sent telegrams to various territorial and federal offices, the true scope of Black Pete Morrison's criminal activities began to emerge. The gang had been responsible for dozens of robberies, several murders, and a network of cattle-rustling operations that had cost ranchers throughout Nebraska, Colorado, and Arizona thousands of dollars in losses. The evidence found in Morrison's possession confirmed every detail of Jeremiah's story, from the corruption of the Cedar Rapids deputies to the location of money stolen in various crimes. Marshal Vaughn found himself in the unusual position of having to officially clear a man he had spent 2 years trying to arrest, a process that would require extensive paperwork and explanations to his superiors in the territorial government. The resolution of Jeremiah's legal troubles created a new set of possibilities that Samuel had never dared to imagine. With the wanted poster officially voided and his name cleared of all charges, Jeremiah was free to build a new life anywhere he chose, and his first priority was securing a better future for the boy who had shown him that heroism sometimes came in small packages. He approached Mrs. Hartwell about formally adopting Samuel, a conversation that led to tears of joy from the kind widow who had watched the boy's transformation over the previous weeks. The legal proceedings would take time to complete, but everyone involved understood that Samuel had already found the family he had been missing since his parents' death. The years that followed brought changes to Tombstone that Samuel could never have imagined during his darkest days in Murphy's saloon. The town grew from a rough frontier settlement into a proper community, complete with a church, a school that expanded to accommodate more children, and businesses that served families rather than just drifters and prospectors. Samuel Cole, now 15 years old and nearly as tall as his adoptive father, had become one of the most respected young men in the territory, known for his intelligence, his skill with horses, and his quiet determination to help others who found themselves in situations similar to his own childhood circumstances. Jeremiah had indeed returned to law enforcement, accepting a position as Deputy Territorial Marshal after Marshal Vaughn personally recommended him for the role. His unique understanding of both sides of the law, combined with his genuine desire to protect the innocent, made him extraordinarily effective at his job. Unlike many lawmen who relied primarily on intimidation and violence, Jeremiah's approach emphasized investigation, negotiation, and the kind of patient detective work that had helped him track down the remaining members of Black Pete Morrison's network. His reputation spread throughout Arizona territory and beyond, but it was built on justice and compassion rather than the fear that had defined his earlier years as a fugitive. The Cole Ranch had prospered beyond their modest initial dreams, growing from a small homestead into one of the most successful operations in the region. Samuel had proven to have a natural gift for breeding and training horses, developing bloodlines that were sought after by ranchers, cavalry units, and even the territorial government. More importantly, the ranch had become an unofficial sanctuary for other children who found themselves orphaned or abandoned, with Jeremiah and Samuel working together to provide temporary homes and permanent solutions for young people who had nowhere else to turn. Mrs. Hartwell, now in her 70s but still energetic, had moved to the ranch to help manage what had essentially become an informal orphanage disguised as a working cattle and horse operation. On Samuel's 16th birthday, as they sat on the same porch where they had shared so many conversations about the future, Jeremiah presented his son with a gift that symbolized how completely their lives had been transformed. It was a badge, smaller than a full deputy's shield but official nonetheless, marking Samuel's appointment as a junior territorial investigator specializing in cases involving children and families. Marshal Vaughn, now the territorial chief marshal, had personally approved the position after observing Samuel's remarkable ability to connect with troubled young people and his mature approach to problem-solving that belied his years. The ceremony that followed drew visitors from across the territory, including several of the children who had found sanctuary at the Cole Ranch over the years and had gone on to build successful lives of their own. Mrs. Hartwell prepared a feast that rivaled anything served in the finest restaurants of Phoenix or Tucson, while Jeremiah stood beside his son with the kind of pride that can only come from watching someone you love exceed every expectation you ever had for them. The gathering represented more than just a birthday celebration. It was a testament to the power of second chances and the ability of human beings to overcome even the most devastating circumstances when they have support and love. As the sun set over the Arizona desert on that special day, painting the sky in the same brilliant colors that had marked so many significant moments in their shared story, Samuel reflected on the journey that had brought him from the sawdust floor of Murphy's saloon to his current position as a young man with unlimited potential and a clear sense of purpose. The scars from his childhood beatings had faded to barely visible marks, but more importantly, the emotional wounds that had once defined his existence had been healed by years of safety, education, and unconditional love from a father who understood the value of protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Jeremiah, now graying at the temples but still possessing the quiet strength that had made him such an effective lawman and father, looked out over the ranch they had built together and felt a satisfaction deeper than anything he had experienced during his years as a sheriff in Cedar Rapids. The family he had lost to violence had been replaced not through forgetting or moving on, but through the creation of something new and beautiful that honored their memory while building toward a better future. Samuel had become not just his son, but his partner in a mission to ensure that no child would suffer the way Samuel had suffered, and no parent would endure the loss that had once driven Jeremiah to the brink of despair. The story of the orphan who was beaten in the saloon every day until a wandering gunslinger decided to protect him had become legend throughout the territory, told and retold in countless variations that emphasized different aspects of the tale depending on the audience and the teller. Some versions focused on the dramatic gunfight with Black Pete Morrison's gang, while others emphasized the quiet moments of healing and growth that had followed Samuel's rescue. But the most important part of the story was not its dramatic beginning or its violent climax, but rather its ongoing continuation in the form of lives that had been transformed and communities that had been made safer through the choices made by two people who refused to accept that suffering was inevitable or that justice was impossible. As the stars appeared in the clear desert sky and the celebration gradually wound down, Samuel and Jeremiah found themselves alone on the porch once more, sharing the comfortable silence that had become their tradition after significant events. The boy who had once counted the sounds of the desert to escape from pain now listened to those same sounds as a young man preparing to spend his life ensuring that other children would never have to develop such survival mechanisms. The man who had once been driven by revenge and desperation now found his purpose in protection and nurturing, proving that even the most damaged souls can find redemption through service to others. In the distance, the lights of Tombstone twinkled like earthbound stars, marking a community that had grown and prospered in part because two broken people had found each other and chosen to build something beautiful from the ruins of their separate tragedies. The saloon where Samuel's nightmare had played out every day for 3 years had become a restaurant where families gathered to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries, while the ranch where he now lived served as a beacon of hope for anyone who believed that the past did not have to determine the future. Their story had become part of the larger narrative of the American West, proving that the frontier could be a place of healing and growth rather than merely violence and survival. And so, as the desert settled into the peaceful quiet of another evening, Samuel Cole and his father Jeremiah looked toward tomorrow with the confidence of people who had learned that love, courage, and determination could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it might initially appear. Their journey together was far from over, but they faced whatever challenges lay ahead secure in the knowledge that they would meet them as a family, united by bonds forged in adversity and strengthened by years of shared purpose. The orphan had found his protector, the gunslinger had found his redemption, and together they had discovered that sometimes the most powerful weapon against darkness is simply refusing to let it win.